After the death of a certain CEO, a lot of people were wondering, why could our generation be so supportive of the person who did it? That was a big question on many people's minds because they looked at this and they saw it as objectively bad. And in many ways it is. This is not an analysis of the event itself, but rather the big question, why did it appeal to our generation? And when thinking about this, it really allowed me to understand so many different aspects of who we are and where our American society has come to, where our culture has come to. That it took me from anywhere from Luke Skywalker and Omni-Man all the way to art paintings and the idea of societal trust. So in these series of videos, we're going to look into exactly that. Why did this appeal to Generation Z? So let's look into it. First, as I'll say probably a bunch of times in this series, this is not about the particular event, and this is not a defense or a support or anything like that. Rather, it's an analysis of the environment and the personal factors that have made so much of Gen Z susceptible to being interested in Luigi. Then the next thing I want to talk about is why this will be so different from a lot of the other analysis videos on this topic or similar topics. And that's because rather than it being some complex narrative with evidence and statistics, although I should have some of those, it's not going to be about the particular event or about understanding our society at a deeper level. Rather, it's going to be understanding ourselves and how we got there. It's about understanding who Generation Z is and how we got to the point as an entire generation of being susceptible to this. Why is this an important distinction? Because a lot of really smart people have made great video essays about analyzing how this act, was defeating capitalism, or how it's one more reason why we should protest more, or that politics is dead, or that young people are stupid, or whatever. Like, there's a lot of videos like that, and that have very good points. But again, they take it a little too deeply because your average Gen Zer does not know all the background of this particular event. They don't know the history of United Healthcare and how they treated their patients or treated their providers. They don't know about the history of political acts of oppression, right? They just know what they've been involved with. They know what they feel. And that's what this video is about. And that's what these videos will be about. How we got to the point where we're feeling this way. First, who is Gen Z? Well, let's start very basically. We're not millennials, okay? Millennials were born from 1981 to 1995. And a lot of older people, particularly grandparents and even some people Gen X age, my parents, they get confused by this. They tend to think that anyone coming after them are millennials. But this is a really important thing to start out with because millennials come from very different background and way of thinking than we do as Gen Z. And if we're going to understand why this topic appealed so much to our generation, we'll have to start there. What are the differences? First, starting out, it's not just about personality traits and hairstyles. It's not like our generation is just about the curly haired broccoli look, or millennials are just about skinny jeans. That's not just what it's about. There are some really core fundamental things. And it also goes and it coincides with Luigi actually being the same age as our generation. He actually is Gen Z. I think he was born in 1997 or 1998. So that coincides not just with the actual event, but it coincides with our generation as well. So what's the most important thing we'll have to learn about millennials? Well, they grew up in the self-esteem era. They grew up in an era where trying to make people believe in themselves, love themselves, and especially children, was something that was taking over our culture by storm. And if you've watched any of my videos or you watch any after, you'll see that I talk a lot about Jean Twenge, who wrote several books on generations. She actually wrote one on millennials as well called Generation Me, which talks exactly about this self-esteem issue. But we're going to reference her book Generations, which goes into depth on all of the different generations. And one aspect, one part of the book, she brings up this graph, and I'll put it here. And you can see in the graph that just around the time of millennials, as they were growing up, self-esteem was hitting a record high. It was going up like crazy. This was such a fad at the time that in response to a contrary article by the New York Times, a father wrote in in defense. She says, quoting this man, "I don't think we give children too many trophies. If anything, we might not give them enough. Trophies help boost a child's confidence," wrote one young adult in response to a 2013 New York Times op ed criticizing the practice. The op ed was titled, "Losing is Good for You." Once you receive a trophy, you feel like you can do more. It can build up your confidence and self esteem, argued another. So, as you can see, this concept of self esteem was really important while the millennials grew up. Closing out one of her sections, she says, "In short, as far back as we have measures, and as both teens and young adults, millennials are the most optimistic and self confident generation in history." This is in huge contrast to Generation Z. It's amazing the difference that 10 to 15 years can make, because in that time, our technology and our culture progressed in big ways. For one, we grew up and some of our first memories were of the 2008 financial recession that hit our families very hard and hit our entire country and the world very hard. And so while they were growing up with self-esteem and participation trophies and self-belief and self-love, some of our first memories were of the 2008 financial recession. But more than that, from there, Gene Twing and Jonathan Haidt both talk about how social media and smartphones became a big thing in around 2012. So just 4 years later, while the oldest of Gen Z are around 18, 15, 16, they're in that teenage range. What's happening? Well, social media becomes a big element of our lives, along with smartphones. And as Jonah Berger talks about in his book on how ideas go viral, he talks about how it's the arousing emotions that make your body upset, that make you want to do something, right? Those are the things that go viral. It's the things that make you disgusted. Okay, those are the things that turn you on, but also the things that make you angry. And so we see, along with social media and smartphones, all of these toxic negative emotions start spreading more and more and more. But more than even that, we see the rise of internalizing disorders I've talked about in other videos, which is how around 2012 there was a big uptick in things like depression, anxiety, and Jonathan Haidt and Gene Twenge both target social media and smartphones as being the main cause, because rather than socializing with our friends, rather than hanging out in parties and groups and challenging ourselves and having lots of connections and face-to-face interaction, instead we are behind a screen. So there's this increase in loneliness that you feel alongside of that we grew up around the same time. So that's why it's so important to start first with millennials, because we see that 10 to 15 year gap was a huge difference both in optimism but also a huge difference in anxiety and depression and a lot of the insecurities that we feel. Along with this trend comes another big one, and that is the decrease in societal trust, in social trust. What does that mean first before we go into it? Well, it means how much do you trust the news media? How much do you trust universities? How much do you trust professors? How much do you even trust your neighbor? How much do you trust a stranger that you haven't met? That's the concept of societal or social trust. And this, particularly among institutions, has really gone down, starting first with our parents' generation, Generation X. That's something, once again, that Jean Twenge talks about in her book and the chapter on Generation X, how that's where a decrease, a kind of cynicism started, or at least really took hold. Now, you can argue that it took hold somewhat with the boomers and the anti-institutionalism, the hippie movement, right? And that very well could be the case. However, you'd see it most pronouncedly first with Generation X. And from there, it looks like in a lot of ways that our generation has continued that trend all the way to the lowest it has been in a long time. In 1979, almost 50% said they had a great deal of trust in American institutions. And now that number is all the way down, almost halved, down to 27%. And I'm going to put all of my notes and the resources for this down in the comments below. But you can see almost just from that in 1979, which again, by the way, is about when Generation X started really being respondents in this. So as that started, so came a huge decline, almost by half. The Gallup and Walton Family Foundation then more in the present, surveyed our generation, Gen Z, and among the Gen Z respondents, they found that fully 50% said that they had little to no trust in Congress. 46% said they had little to no trust in the presidency, and fully 38% said they had little to no trust in the Supreme Court. And those are just a couple off the top, but a lot of other ones also appeared in similar surveys being low. And it's crazy when you see that compared to 1979, right? What was that? It was 50%. So half had a great deal. And you look at our generation and things like Congress, which in many ways should be not a bastion of politics, which is understandable, but it shouldn't just be that. Congress was made to represent the people. It was made that we as the people, that voters, are the ones electing them, that we're the ones choosing them. So we should have more trust in Congress because they should be the people's voice. That's the whole idea of having your representative in Congress, that they're going to represent your interest. And yet, Gen Z, on the exact institution that you should predict for us to have the highest amount of trust, have some of the lowest ever recorded. And what's even more fascinating is that the ones that played the best, the ones that we had the most trust in, were things like science and the medical system. It seemed like Gen Z had the most trust in those two out of the other ones. And we're going to come back to that later. That's really important to remember, that we seem to have the most trust in science and the medical system. And there's this really good Substack that I'm going to have to look down to read off the full name. A little bit of a wordy name, but it goes into exactly the kind of trust that you have with a stranger or a neighbor. Not necessarily the big institutional trust, but that kind of trust. It's called why you should just about always trust your neighbors. Maple Street, the decline in bridging social capital, and why strangers aren't the real danger, by Griffin. I'm gonna say Gooch. I'm guessing Gooch, but this, despite the wordy title, it really is excellent, and with such a big topic, a relatively small article about how really there is this decline overall in how much we trust our neighbors and how this really hurts our communities and it hurts our lives because most people are exactly that, people. They're people just like you and me. And when we have this instant distrust because of constantly seeing negative messages, negative news headlines on and on, it hurts and makes us feel more isolated and alone. But to sum up what he says, he writes, if actually he quotes the social scientist Jamil Zaki, and he says, if trust was money, its plunge would match the stock market's fall during the Great Recession, which to me was a great quote that summed up exactly what we're dealing with as a generation. The question then is, what are the benefits of a higher trust society? Why does it even matter if we don't trust our neighbor or we don't trust an institution or whatever? Well, then we're missing some really important benefits. Like, for instance, the idea of social cohesion, right? That sounds like a big word, but all it means is that you function well in your community, that you can go outside, talk to someone, and they're going to help you. And that concept, that relationship is then reciprocated with others. They help another person and on and on. Like, that changes an entire dynamic when you have that. When you don't, like I said before, people feel isolated and alone. But more than that, it also is about democratic functioning, right? That, like, again, we talked about, you should be able to trust that your representative is going to represent you properly. And that allows you to then care more instead of this apathetic detachment that so much of our generation is dealing with. And when you look at the negatives, okay, aside from just well-being, which I think is really important, it really increases your well-being when you feel like you can trust people. Like that should not be a surprise to anyone. That feeling like you can trust someone and that you're not surrounded by a bunch of murderous thugs at all times, that actually helps you. It makes you feel better, right? That should be pretty obvious. But when you look at the negatives, it ends up reading almost like a description of the life we live now, of the culture that we live in now. Things like economic challenges, like not knowing where your next job's going to be, or if your employer is going to lay you off because you don't really trust them. With normal transactions, you go to a store and you're wondering if someone's going to con you, if someone's going to commit a fraud, right? You don't realize how much trust is baked into so many normal interactions that you have in an economy, in selling something, in buying something from someone, or just having a an agreement, having a contract, and believing that it's actually going to be fulfilled. Not just economics and isolation, but it also leads to a mental health impact. When you can't trust anyone, right? How much can you really trust yourself? You end up second guessing yourself because when we think about this, we have a little bit of an artificial distinction between self and others. But it's not quite that simple. You can't do that much literally by yourself. If you're locked in a room, how much are you going to be able to do? In order for you to do things, you have to interact with the world. What's the world made of? People. So if you can't trust the people outside, if you can't trust, go on your phone and trust that that your lift is going to come, or that they're not going to hurt you, right? If you can't trust that, then how much can you do? How much do you feel like you can be effective in the world, that you can accomplish something, that you're safe, that you're secure, right? All of these things become in question when you don't trust the people around you and the world around you. And that's one of the huge negative effects, not just economics and democracy, which are very important, but also the mental impact, the mental health impact of not being able to trust. So, in this environment of low trust, like we were talking about, of feeling insecure, like we talked about earlier, now I want to introduce one other element. A lot of anthropologists, psychologists talk about something that's very interesting, particularly John Archer's research looks into this, and that is that unequal or inequitable wealth distribution. You have billionaires who have tons of money, and then lots of people who have very little money. In those types of societies, where there's also low mate choice for young men, where it's harder for them to have a date, to find a long-term relationship. What happens? Well, actually, he looks at these societies over the course of many years, and he sees that in those time periods where those two things are true, violence tends to go up quite a bit. There tends to be a lot more violence and um, social disruption because of these factors. One quote by him that I think sums it up pretty well is he says, "The research evidence highlights that societal issues, such as inequality of wealth and competition between males, may contribute to the violence we see in today's society." I love that. I love that as a quote because it sums up his idea. But this is also something that other anthropologists have looked at in the past and in other societies as well. That once again, when there's a big unequal distribution between people at the top and people at the bottom, and then it's harder for young men to find someone to settle down with, to have a long-term relationship, or even feel like they have that option, that they have that ability, that violence often goes up. So then, based on this, where is Gen Z's natural habitat? Where are we looking for romantic partners to date, etc.? Well, actually, and this is going to come as no surprise, that the places people look and find future romantic partners has totally changed in the past 20 years or so. And I found a really good graph to kind of sum that up. But when you look at it, all of a sudden, at around, I want to say it was early 2000s, but it could have been even before that. And I'm going to put up the graph because I don't have it up in front of me. But you can see that the rate of online dating has shot up astronomically to the point where we're looking that I believe it was almost 50% of Gen Z couples are meeting online. So how does this relate to what we were talking about before with Professor John Archer's ideas of unequal distribution of wealth while at the same time mate competition and not being able to find someone? How does that have anything to do with each other? Well, the question, like I said earlier, is where are we meeting people? And if we're meeting people online, then we should be looking at who is online. How are people meeting? How easy is it? And what's the distribution between people? Well, the top one, to no surprise for our Gen Zers and probably millennials too, is that Tinder is by far number one. And furthermore, they boast that fully 50% of their user base is between ages of 18 20 to 25. Now, I don't remember the date, but I know that was at least 5 years ago. So now it's going to be more our age, but they were fully Gen Zers. So why is this important? Well, if you look at the statistics, the ratio between men and women on Tinder is about 76% to around 24%. So exactly what Professor Archer is talking about is happening in the biggest platform by far for how we today are meeting um, future future partners. The exact platform that's number one has the exact distribution that would increase the levels of violence, or the violence that you would expect based upon his research. More than this, though, it's not just Tinder, which is very important, but also when you look at things like the General Social Survey, which is considered in many people like the holy grail of generational research, when you look at that, well, what do you see? You see that fully 1 out of 3 men ages below 30 had not had sex in the past year. 1 out of 3 in a full calendar year. So that shows that it's not just something on Tinder alone. Like, maybe that's just its own sample size. Maybe that's just kind of weird. It's on its own little island. No, actually, when you look at big pieces of data like the General Social Survey, you see the same type of thing. So what does this lead to? If what he's saying is really true, shouldn't we see an uptick in violence when we look at the statistics? Well, actually, no, we don't. That's the fascinating part. We don't see this uptick. So wait, is what he's saying wrong? Well, no. Here's what I'll argue. I'll argue it's rather a very different phenomenon because Gen Z is meeting people online, not in the real world. The way that we're going to be handling that, the way that we're going to be conceptualizing, feeling like we're rejected or not interested in, one thing I left out was that a lot of studies show that the top 5 to 10% of men in attractiveness are the ones that get by far the amount of interest. So even though there's this giant disparity of men to women, it's even worse than that, at least on Tinder. So why? Back to what we were talking about before. Why is that so interesting? Why is that so important? Well, rather than us acting out, rather than young men who are having this trouble and going through these experiences, rather than them acting out, what might be happening? Is his research just completely wrong? Well, no, I will argue the exact opposite. I think we're taking this inside. That's part of the reason with this rise of internalizing disorders, this rise of things like depression and anxiety, and all these inward focused trouble. Because historically, if you look back to how men and women react, to how more masculine people, more feminine people react as far as psychology goes, when they're struggling with something, someone who's more on the masculine side are going to act out. They're going to do externalizing behavior. They're going to hurt someone or commit violence, threaten violence, get angry, right? A lot of these things are acting outward in the world. Versus someone who's more on the feminine side, they tend to take it more inwardly. They tend to focus more on themselves and how they're feeling and how it sucks, and anxiety and depression, it's all inward focused, right? And that's where you see things like um, self harm, right? That's a big one. Self harm. So, why? What does this have anything to do with? Well, I think that we're taking a lot of this energy that might have been focused in the past out out into the world, and we're taking that and focusing more inside. Because what is a smartphone really? Well, in a lot of ways, it's this personal portal into the online world. It's this personal portal. And in that portal, we're then taking out this energy, okay? And it becomes this inward internalizing process because rather than it seeming like we're, going out and doing unspeakable things on a street or something. Rather, we're saying terrible things online or following people that we probably shouldn't, or even just finding other avenues online to take this and to take this negative energy. And so it ends up manifesting like an internalizing behavior, like something dedicated inward because of that personal experience of you and your smartphone, or you on your computer, or you and your video games. It's all this inward, individualistic, just one person isolated phenomenon. So while things like violence and alcoholism, things about acting outward are going down, what's also happening? Well, things like video game addiction and porn addiction, they're going up. So the exact externalizing things are going down while the internalizing things are going up. We're taking this frustration that our society and where we're at in this modern life, or this environment, this cultural environment we're in, and we're taking that and putting that into the online world. We're putting that into our phones and computers and video games and pornography, and that's where we're turning it into instead of turning it into that word, which in many ways is probably a good thing overall. But yet, it helps this concept helps us understand why we're feeling the way that we do, and why that as a generation we're so ready to be interested, or to in some cases be supportive of what happened in this United Healthcare incident. What happened to that CEO, and the person who did it? Why we would be interested in that? Because we've been put in a place where we have such low trust, where we didn't grow up with self-esteem. We grew up with the financial crisis, and we grew up with the start of these internalizing disorders, while also feeling like we're not going to be able to find someone, that we might not be able to find someone who's going to truly love us for us, and we don't trust that, you know, our neighbors might be able to help us, or strangers, or that anyone's really on our side, and we don't feel like we can trust institutions, and we don't feel like all these things. And then remember what I told you to remember before? Well, what are the things that our generation often um, esteems the highest, that we put the most trust in, that we think about and actually take care of the most? Well, it's things like science and healthcare. And what is an insurance company, and what were they accused of in this case? Well, they were accused of hurting, and this is all an accusation, but this is how people are perceiving it. So that's the important part. This is about perception. And people have perceived that this incident was against someone who was corrupting healthcare and science. That this institution that our generation distrusts was corrupting healthcare and science, some of the things that we trust the most. And so, in many ways, when you look at this, you see all of the breadcrumbs of the issues that we have with our life, the issues that we have with our culture and with our social environment. So that was a look into how our social environment, how our society has poised Gen Z to be more supportive of something that many people consider to be totally beyond the pale. In the next video, we're going to look into how the personal values of Gen Z and what we're personally inwardly struggling with has made us more susceptible to being interested in this and supportive. So thanks for looking into it, and I'll see you in the next one.